When Prince William's voice rang out, reading the final words of Queen Elizabeth's ascension, it wasn't just a farewell ritual. It was a moment that unleashed a shockwave the Queen had quietly held back throughout her reign. In the ancient library of Buckingham Palace beneath dim golden lamplight, in the silent gaze of ancestral portraits, William stood among the highest-ranking royals, his hands trembling slightly as he broke the royal seal on the envelope. His voice echoed low resolute, each word slicing through the already tense air. And then as the final lines were spoken, the room fell still as if turned to stone. No one spoke. No one dared breathe. Because this will didn't just divide jewels and estates. It divided trust. It reopened wounds that had never healed. In a family accustomed to silence and decorum, this will was a blade cutting through titles, piercing relationships. Who did the Queen choose to carry her legacy? Who was cast aside in a history now shifting? And when wealth becomes the ultimate test of loyalty, what remains to hold those left behind together? The wind howled through the towering stained-glass windows of Buckingham Palace's library, rattling the ancient panes as if the spirits of royal forebears were stirring. The ancestral portraits on the walls seemed to hold their breath, their painted eyes frozen in judgment. At the room's center stood Prince William, the weight of history heavy on his shoulders. In his hands was Queen Elizabeth II's final will, a document that would reshape the House of Windsor forever. William's voice was steady, cautious as he began to read. The room was packed with royals, King Charles III, his face a mask of control. Queen Camilla, her hands clenched beneath a delicate white lace handkerchief. Princess Catherine, composed yet vigilant, and Prince Harry, jaw-tight eyes locked on his brother. Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie sat rigid, their faces a mix of curiosity and dread. The air was thick, each word from William's lips, a spark threatening to ignite a powder keg. At first the bequests were predictable titles, trust funds, minor estates. Then came the shocks. Balmoral Castle. William read his voice, unwavering, will not pass to King Charles III as tradition dictates. Instead, it will be jointly managed by Prince William and Princess Catherine, Princess of Wales, to preserve its role as a family home, not a throne. A collective murmur of astonishment rippled through the room, the air tightening. Charles's eyes closed for a moment, his face flickering with pain he tried to conceal. Camilla gripped her lace handkerchief, her knuckles whitening as if suppressing a tidal wave of emotion. Balmoral, the Queen's retreat for rest and family connection, was more than an estate. It was the embodiment of her love and memories. Passing its stewardship to William and Catherine, bypassing the king, was unthinkable, a dagger to royal tradition. William continued, his voice even but heavy with judgment. The historic crown jewelry collection, including the Vladimir tiara, will primarily pass to Princess Catherine, Princess of Wales. Only 2 pieces are designated for other princesses, a 3-strand pearl necklace worn by the Queen during private tea times at Sandringham for Princess Beatrice, and a pair of diamond teardrop earrings, a gift from a French diplomat in the 1960s for Princess Eugenie. No other allocations are specified in the will. Camilla's head snapped up, her lips parting, her eyes flashing with undisguised hurt. Not a single jewel for her, the Queen consort, a bitter omission, as if the Queen had deliberately erased her from her legacy. Catherine's face remained serene, but her fingers grazed the edge of her chair, betraying a flicker of tension. Beatrice and Eugenie exchanged a quick glance, their eyes a mix of surprise and discontent. The pearl necklace, elegant with shimmering pearls strung on delicate white gold, was a modest piece tied to private moments, not power. The diamond earrings, sparkling with intricately cut stones suspended from platinum, were understated compared to the grandeur of the Vladimir tiara. These small jewels, though historically valuable, felt like a painful reminder of the sisters' secondary status compared to Catherine, who inherited nearly the entire crown's treasure. Then came Harry's inheritance. Sandringham estate is bequeathed to Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, with the condition he must reside in the United Kingdom for at least 1 month each year to maintain his ancestral connection to the homeland. Harry's eyes narrowed, his body stiffening. A condition. It felt like a chain tethering him to a country he'd left behind. He glanced at William, searching for signs of complicity, but his brother's face revealed nothing. The surprises didn't end. To Princess Beatrice, I bequeath my personal art collection, including unpublished works by Vermeer and Turner, to preserve for future generations. Beatrice blinked, stunned. Eugenie beside her froze, her hands clenching in her lap. Why only her sister? The sisters exchanged a fleeting, tense glance. Finally, the most shocking revelation. An independent cultural council outside the king's control will oversee the queen's personal archives, photographs, documentaries, and handwritten diaries. Princess Catherine, Princess of Wales, is appointed honorary advisor with full authority to guide the council's mission. The room plunged into silence, a suffocating stillness that stung the senses. Catherine, not Charles, would control the queen's legacy. This was a move that stripped symbolic power from the king, placing it in the hands of the next generation. William folded the will, placing it on the table. No one spoke. The portraits on the walls seemed to lean closer, whispering, "This is the fracture you've all been waiting for." The sun hung low over Buckingham Palace, its weak golden-orange light filtering through heavy silk curtains, casting long shadows across the king's private study. The polished walnut floor reflected the glow, but the room felt cold, as if the echoes of past confrontations lingered. King Charles III stood by the large window, hands clasped behind his back, his shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of his perfectly tailored coat. He gazed at the royal gardens, where late-season roses wilted, but his mind was elsewhere in the gray-white library, where his mother's will had torn apart the fragile veneer of family unity. Prince William sat opposite on a crimson velvet chair, his hands resting calmly on his knees. But the calm was a facade. His heart pounded, each beat a warning bell. The reading of the will hours earlier had left a gaping wound, not just in the hearts of those present, but in the very foundation of the monarchy. This conversation, he knew, would determine whether that wound could be stitched or torn open forever. "What did you think when you read it?" Charles asked, his voice low, almost fragile but laced with an unmistakable edge. He didn't turn, as if facing his son directly would cost him his last shred of control. William took a deep breath, his eyes locked on his father's back. "I think she decided long ago," he said, his voice steady, each word carefully measured. "I only read what she left for us." Charles turned, his movements slow but deliberate. His eyes were icy, a thin blade slicing through the air. "Speak plainly, William," he said, his voice lower, almost a whisper but thick with authority. "I need the truth." "Is this the only version?" The question hung between them, heavy as an accusation. The air in the room thickened, pressing against William's chest. He hesitated just a moment, but long enough for Charles to notice. William's mind flashed back 3 weeks to a cozy drawing room at Balmoral Castle. The fireplace crackled, the scent of pine and faint smoke in the air. Queen Elizabeth II, frail but upright in an armchair, her piercing blue eyes as sharp as ever, took his hand, bony but strong, and said, "William, do what you believe is right, even if it may displease others." At the time, he hadn't grasped the full weight of her words. He thought they were a grandmother's advice to her grandson, encouragement for his growing responsibilities. But now, standing at the crossroads of loyalty to his father and the mission his grandmother entrusted, he realized the Queen had foreseen this storm. She knew her will would not just divide assets, but fracture the family. "There's only one version," William said at last, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "The one I read." Charles studied him, his eyes narrowing, searching for any hint of deception. He knew his son knew William's resolve, but also his ability to mask emotion when needed. A long moment passed, broken only by the ticking of the gold clock on the mantel. Finally, Charles gave a curt nod, almost reluctant. "Then we live with it," he said, turning back to the window, as if to end the conversation. William stood adjusting his coat and left the room. But as the heavy wooden door closed behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that his father's trust had cracked, if only slightly. He walked down the palace's long corridor, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, wondering if he'd truly told the whole truth. The will in his hands was the only one, yes, but the Queen's final words, unwritten, still echoed in his mind, a secret he wasn't ready to share. Camilla didn't seek out William. She didn't want to face the man who'd read the will, who seemed to hold the key to a truth she couldn't reach. Instead, she sought Catherine. That afternoon, the two women met in a small drawing room at Clarence's house, a secluded corner far from the prying eyes of the press and advisors. The room was elegantly appointed with pastoral paintings on pale floral wallpaper, and a small fireplace crackling softly. But no warmth filled the space. Only the hum of tension and unspoken melody vibrating between two women, one who'd long been a shadow in history and one stepping into its light. Camilla sat first on a pale green silk chair, her royal posture impeccable, but her eyes weary as if decades of fighting for acceptance had drained her. Catherine, in an elegant gray wool dress, stood a moment, her gaze sweeping the room as if assessing the battlefield. Then she sat opposite, hands folded neatly in her lap, every gesture radiating perfect composure. "Have you ever wondered," Camilla began, her voice soft but sharp as a thin blade, "what it feels like to lose everything?" Catherine didn't respond. Her face was a serene mask, her blue eyes betraying no emotion. But inwardly, she felt the weight of the question, not just an opener, but a veiled accusation. Camilla leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly, her wedding ring glinting under the lamplight. "I thought she'd rewrite history," she said, her voice lower, almost a whisper, as if the walls might overhear. "That finally I wouldn't be the other woman in the world's eyes. I waited, hoped that in that will there'd be a line, just one line acknowledging me, even a small jewel, a small gesture. But nothing, Catherine. Not a single word." Camilla's voice trembled on the last word, a rare crack in the resilient shell she'd built over decades. She looked directly at Catherine, searching for a reaction, a sign of empathy or even triumph. But Catherine remained silent, her lips slightly pursed, as if weighing each word. Finally, Catherine spoke, her voice steady, but gentle, like someone walking a tightrope. Perhaps she saw no need to name someone unworthy. The words landed like a stone in a still pond. Camilla let out a sharp, bitter laugh, brief but laden with pain. She leaned back, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and hurt. "Or perhaps," she said, her voice now sharper, "you knew it all along." The accusation hung heavy unanswered. Catherine held Camilla's gaze unflinching, but her mind churned. "She suspects me," she thought. "Not just suspects, but believes I had a hand in shaping the will." But what was the truth? Catherine wasn't sure. She only remembered her conversations with the Queen, moments when she'd held her hand and spoken of the duties of the future. No explicit mention of the will, no hints of these shocking decisions. But was she truly blameless? The meeting ended without further words. Camilla stood, smoothed her dress, and left with a cold nod. Catherine lingered, her eyes fixed on the fireplace's flames, her mind a tangle of doubt. That night, as she and William prepared for bed in their minimalist Kensington Palace bedroom, she turned to him, her voice barely audible, as if afraid the darkness itself might eavesdrop. "Did you alter the will?" she asked, her eyes searching her husband's face in the dim light. She knew it was a foolish, almost absurd question, but an urgent instinct compelled her to ask. William didn't meet her gaze. He turned away, his hand pausing on the light switch. "No," he said, his voice even, but lacking warmth. Then he flicked off the light, plunging the room into darkness. Catherine lay down, her eyes wide, staring at the ceiling, a wave of unease rising within her. William might be telling the truth, but if he wasn't lying, why did she feel like she was standing on the edge of an abyss? A light drizzle fell on the gravel paths leading to Frogmore Cottage, cloaking the small house in a misty veil as it nestled amid lush green gardens. The gray, heavy sky mirrored Prince Harry's mood as he stepped from the black car parked at the gate. Just hours earlier, he'd sat in Buckingham Palace's library listening to his brother read the Queen's will, a document that didn't just divide assets, but widened the chasm between him and his family. Harry's face was a storm of suppressed rage, his dark brown eyes flashing with cold intensity, but beneath it lay a deep, aching pain, like a wound that had never healed from his years of stepping away from royal life. In Frogmore's modest living room, Prince William waited. He stood near the fireplace, where a small fire crackled, its warmth too weak to dispel the chill in the air. The room, with cream-painted walls and rustic wooden furniture, had once been a place of rare closeness for the brothers, late-night laughter, shared dreams of the future. Now it felt like an arena where words could become weapons. William, in a navy suit, stood straight but relaxed, his hands in his pockets to hide his tension. The brothers hadn't spoken privately in months, and now the air between them crackled with distrust, like a taut string about to snap. Harry didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, his puffer jacket still glistening with raindrops, his fists clenched. "You knew she wrote another version?" he said, his voice low, dangerous like a cornered animal. I have a photo, a draft. There was a line she crossed out, my grandson shall not be bound by formal duty. That line wasn't in the version you read today. The accusation cut through the room like a knife. William's face remained impassive, but his heart pounded, blood rushing to his ears. He remembered that draft vividly, as if it lay before him. Months ago at Balmoral, the Queen had summoned him to her study. She sat frail but resolute, her thin hands holding a thick sheet of paper covered in her handwritten notes. "Read it, William," she said, her voice soft but commanding. He'd read in that line, "My grandson shall not be bound by formal duty," stood out like a promise of freedom for Harry. But then she took her pen with a resolve that chilled him and struck it out. "Some bonds must be maintained," she said, her eyes distant, as if seeing the future. William hadn't questioned her. He'd nodded and left. Now facing Harry, he felt the weight of that moment on his shoulders. Harry stepped closer, his boots leaving faint mud marks on the rug. His voice dropped to a whisper, each word sharp as an arrow. "You don't have to lie to me, Will, but don't lie to your children." The words hit William like a punch to the chest. They weren't just an accusation, but a reminder of his responsibility, not just to Harry, but to the next generation, to George, Charlotte, and Louis, who would one day face the legacy of these decisions. William opened his mouth, wanting to explain that he'd only followed her wishes, that he had no choice, but the words caught in his throat. Harry, with eyes both furious and pained, seemed to see through him not just the brother, but a man trapped between loyalty and duty. William wanted to say he was bound too, that the will wasn't just a cage for Harry, but chains for himself. But he couldn't. Harry didn't wait for an answer. He turned striding toward the door, each step heavy with a lifetime of resentment. At the threshold, he paused, his back to his brother. "If the will is a cage," he said, his voice low and cold, "then the one who reads it is the jailer in a suit." The wooden door closed with a sharp click, the sound echoing in the now empty room. William stood alone, the firelight dancing on his face, its warmth unable to touch the cold spreading through his bones. He looked at his hands, fingers trembling slightly, and wondered if Harry was right. Had he, as the will's reader, unwittingly become his brother's keeper? In that moment, a memory of Harry's smile, the smile of a younger brother, once his closest friend, flashed before him, only to dissolve like smoke in the firelight. In a quiet corner of Kensington Palace, the pale afternoon light filtered through thin silk curtains, bathing the room in a soft silver glow. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie sat across from each other at a polished mahogany table, its surface reflecting wood grains like tiny rivers. The room, with its towering bookshelves and the faint scent of lavender from a porcelain vase, should have been a haven of peace. But the air between the sisters was heavy, stifling, thick with unspoken grievances, the kind of emotion that only exists between those who once shared every secret but are now divided by rivalry and hurt. Eugenie sat upright, her hands clasped tightly on the table, her dark brown eyes burning with a mix of pain and anger. Her navy dress accentuated her elegance, but it couldn't hide the tension in her movements. "You got the entire art collection," she said, her voice strained, each word forced through gritted teeth. "I got nothing. She told us we'd share what she loved." "Sonanu, I remember Beatrice," she said it when we sat with her at Windsor drinking tea, admiring those paintings. "Why did she choose only you?" Beatrice, her brown hair neatly tied back in a simple cream sweater, sighed, her fingers grazing the table's edge as if to soothe herself. She looked at her sister, her eyes a mix of pity and exhaustion. "You didn't visit her after your pregnancy, Eugenie," she said, her voice gentle but with an edge that cut. "You were busy with events galleries. You went to art shows to build your brand, your image. But did you ever sit with her just to listen to her talk about those paintings? Maybe she noticed." Beatrice's words were a dagger piercing Eugenie's pride. She let out a short, bitter laugh, her hands clenching until her knuckles whitened. "So you think I'm unworthy?" she asked, her voice trembling with rage. "Or did you know beforehand you played the right side, didn't you, Beatrice? You knew who the Queen would favor, and you aligned yourself with them." The accusation was sharp and venomous. Beatrice blinked, her face momentarily stiffening, but she quickly regained her composure. "Eugenie," she said, her voice lower, almost pleading, "this isn't about sides. She chose because she saw something in me. Maybe dedication, maybe just presence. I don't know, but you can't blame me for her decisions." Eugenie didn't respond. She stood her chair scraping against the wooden floor and left the room without another word. The door closed behind her, leaving Beatrice alone, her eyes fixed on the empty table. A sense of unease stirred within her. She knew her sister wouldn't let this go, and she was right. The next day, a leaked photo appeared on social media posted from an obscure anonymous account. It was an image of a painting from the Queen's personal collection, a Turner, with swirling blues and golds like a storm at sea. Beneath it, a cryptic but pointed caption, "Some legacies shouldn't be kept by those who only frame them." The post spread like wildfire, garnering thousands of shares and comments. The press pounced with sensational headlines. "Princess Eugenie's rebellion and royal art scandal erupts." No one knew who was behind the account, but Beatrice, seeing the post, felt a chill run down her spine. She knew her sister was clever and hurt enough to strike such a blow. In the quiet Kensington Palace room, Beatrice held her phone, her fingers scrolling over the screen, rereading the caption. She wondered if she and her sister could ever reclaim their lost bond, or if the will had forever turned them into rivals in a game where no one truly wins. Under the dim glow of crystal chandeliers in a locked room at Buckingham Palace, a clandestine meeting unfolded where the monarchy's fate seemed to balance on a knife's edge. The room, with dark oak-paneled walls and thick Persian rugs, exuded grandeur, but felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves held secrets too dangerous to escape. The heavy double doors were bolted, and two guards stood outside, ensuring no one could enter. But what no one in the room knew, not even the most powerful among them, was that Albert, an elderly footman and once a loyal confidant of Princess Diana, had discreetly hidden a tiny recording device in a crevice of an antique bookshelf. Albert, a wiry man with silver hair and deep-set eyes, had served the palace for over 3 decades, always silent, always discreet. In the 1980s and 1990s, he was Diana's trusted ally, witnessing her tears during long nights at Kensington Palace, hearing her speak of the isolation, the hypocrisy of the royal family, and her dream to live authentically. Diana's 1995 BBC interview, exposing the underbelly of her marriage and the monarchy, left a lasting mark on Albert. He believed Diana wanted the world to see the truth behind the facade of power, and that she never completed that mission before her death. When he overheard William reading the Queen's will and the fractures it caused, he saw echoes of the hypocrisy Diana fought against. He placed the recording device, believing that exposing the deceit in this meeting, where the royals vied for power under a guise of unity, was a way to carry on Diana's work to tear down the monarchy's curtain and let the public see the conflicts and selfishness within. Inside the room, the monarchy's key figures sat around a long mahogany table, each carrying their own wounds and ambitions. King Charles III sat at the head, his hands rigid on the armrests, his face a fortress, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Queen Camilla sat beside him, her emerald silk dress highlighting her regal bearing, but her tightly pursed lips revealed her tension. Prince William and Princess Catherine sat opposite, spaced just enough to maintain an appearance of unity, but not close enough to hide their distance. Two royal advisors, a seasoned lawyer and a veteran diplomat, sat at the table's end, quietly taking notes, their eyes scanning the room like hawks over a battlefield. Charles spoke first, his voice sharp as a blade cutting through the stifling silence. "We cannot allow all symbolic power to rest with one person, even if she's my daughter-in-law." His words, though unnamed, clearly targeted Catherine, whom the will had granted control over the Queen's archives and most of the jewelry collection. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to object. No one did. Camilla, with the finesse of a survivor of decades of scandal, followed, her voice cool but laced with false conciliation. "I propose redistributing the jewelry as a gesture of reconciliation," she said, her hands gesturing slightly, a pearl bracelet gleaming under the light. "We can't let the public think one person holds all the Queen's glory. Let's not make Catherine her again." The word "her" carried a slight emphasis and unmistakable nod to Queen Elizabeth II, and a suggestion that Catherine was poised to usurp her aura. Catherine, in her elegant gray wool dress, sat upright, her hands folded in her lap. Her face was a perfect mask of calm, but her blue eyes flashed with steel at Camilla's words. She waited a beat, letting the silence amplify her response's weight. "I asked for nothing," she said, her voice soft, but each word heavy with conviction. But if the cost of preserving the legacy Elizabeth entrusted to me is steep, I'll pay it. Her words, though gentle, were a quiet challenge, not just to Camilla, but to Charles. She wouldn't relinquish the role the Queen had given her, even if it cost the family's unity. William, beside his wife, remained silent throughout. In a navy suit, his shirt collar unbuttoned, he seemed to strain against the room's constraints. But his hand hidden under the table clenched until his knuckles whitened. He felt like a soldier caught between two fronts: loyalty to his father, love for his wife, and the burden of the Queen's final words. He wanted to speak to ease the tension, but every word he considered felt like a betrayal to someone. So he chose silence, though it weighed like a confession. The meeting lasted less than an hour, but each minute felt like a century. No resolution emerged, only sharp words and loaded silences. When the air grew too heavy to bear, Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "If we cannot agree," he said, his voice low but trembling with suppressed fury, "I will decide as king." He looked directly at Catherine, his gaze piercing. "My mother's legacy is not meant to divide us, but if it must, I'll do what's needed to protect the throne." Charles's words were a slow-burning bomb. Camilla grabbed his hand, urging him to sit, but her eyes betrayed her worry. Catherine, for the first time, leaned slightly forward, her voice still calm, but unyielding. "With all due respect, Father," she said, emphasizing father to underscore their family tie, "Elizabeth chose me for this role. I won't betray her trust." William, finally breaking his silence, let out a heavy sigh, his hand tapping the table, a rare outburst. "Enough," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're tearing our family apart," but his words only deepened the room's chill. No one responded. Charles looked away. Camilla bowed her head, and Catherine met William's gaze, her eyes a mix of hurt and defiance. As they left, no one met each other's eyes. The doors opened, and they stepped into the hallway where the wall sconce's light couldn't dispel the darkness enveloping them. But that darkness didn't stay confined. Hours later, Albert's recording leaked to international news outlets, though how remained unclear. Albert, after planting the device, quietly left the palace, leaving a small note in his quarters. "For Diana, the truth will tear down the facade." Headlines screamed, "Royal family implodes," and "Queen's will curse or verdict." The public dubbed the event the Broken Room, the room that shattered the monarchy's fragile unity. On social media, Broken Room trended with millions dissecting every word, every pause in the recording. Some praised Catherine's resolve, others condemned her ambition. Charles and Camilla were painted as desperate throne clingers, while William was dubbed the silent prince, a bystander in his own story. Amid the media storm, Albert vanished, but his act ignited the fire Diana once dreamed of, a blaze that exposed the truth behind the crown. A year after Queen Elizabeth II's passing, the royal family gathered at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle for a memorial. The sky outside was gray, heavy clouds carrying the weight of unresolved conflicts. The chapel, with its ancient stone walls and stained glass windows narrating the monarchy's history, should have been a place of reconciliation and remembrance. But as the royals entered, they didn't resemble a family. They were fragments of a shattered portrait, placed side by side but unable to fit together. Charles and Camilla stood at the front near the altar, where a large portrait of the Queen was framed by pristine white lily wreaths. Their faces were walls of resolve, forged through months of public scrutiny, post-Broken Room. Charles, in a black ceremonial suit, stood tall, but his shoulders sagged slightly as if the crown's weight grew unbearable. Camilla, in a black pillbox hat and silk cloak, held her husband's hand, but her eyes were distant, gazing into an unchangeable past. William and Catherine stood a few steps away near the second pew. They were dressed formally. William in a black suit, Catherine in a deep blue silk dress with a small hat, but the distance between them was palpable, not just physical. Their eyes never met, as if each was lost in private thoughts, unwilling or unable to share. Catherine stood straight, her chin slightly raised, but her hands gripped her clutch tightly, a subtle sign of strain. William, his face weary, looked toward the altar, but his gaze seemed empty, searching for something lost. Harry stood at the back near the entrance, more guest than family. In a simple suit devoid of medals or insignia, he made a quiet statement of detachment. This time his eyes lacked the fury of his confrontation with William at Frogmore. Instead, they were cold, like ice melted into water beyond salvage. He spoke to, no one looked at no one, a solitary figure in the crowd. Beatrice and Eugenie, once inseparable sisters, stood several seats apart. Beatrice, her hair neatly tied in a gray dress, kept her eyes forward, but her lips were tightly pressed as if suppressing emotion. Eugenie, in a black coat, stared at the floor, avoiding her sister's gaze. The distance between them wasn't just physical, but a chasm of betrayal and misunderstanding, deepened by the leaked painting and words too bitter to retract. As the service began, the organ's deep sacred notes filled the space, resonating with loss. William stepped to the podium, his shoes echoing on the marble floor, each step carrying the weight of the monarchy. He stood before the microphone, facing the crowd, not just royals but dignitaries, diplomats, and a few permitted reporters. When he spoke, his voice echoed in the hallowed space, raw with rare sincerity. She held the crown like a mirror. He said, his voice low but clear, each word carved into the air. She reflected truth even when it hurt. But when a mirror breaks, each shard reflects a different truth. And no truth is whole. He paused, his eyes sweeping over his family, father, stepmother, wife, brother, cousins. No one responded. Charles bowed his head. Camilla gripped his hand tighter. Catherine looked down, a single tear glistening on her lash, quickly wiped away. Harry stood still, his eyes fixed on William, but there was no forgiveness or reconciliation in them. Beatrice and Eugenie avoided each other's gaze, as if the other's presence was a reminder of unhealed wounds. William bowed his head, ending his speech. No one clapped. The chapel's bell tolled heavy and slow, signaling the end of an era. As they left, they walked out in silence, no greetings, no glances. The royal family, once a symbol of unity, was now mere fragments, glittering but sharp, unable to form a complete picture.